Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. This is good chatter. It sounds like a family gathering. I guess in many respects, it is a family gathering. So, the one person of you who may not know me, my name is Kaufman. I'm the director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, part of the Kiosk School of Global Affairs. I would like to start by acknowledging our presence on the traditional homelands of native peoples, particularly the Pokagon Potawatomi, who have been using this land for thousands of years and continue to do so. We recognize our place in the history and practices of colonialism and understand that our responsibilities extend beyond this gesture of land acknowledgement. We must also reflect on the University of Notre Dame's past, present, and future relationship with the original stewards of this land and actively pursue ways to amend them. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to Dr. Lisa Schirch's lecture, Mapping Technologies for Peace and Conflict from Weaponization of Social Media to the Digital Peace Building and the Peace Tech. While this lecture in itself is an exciting event, we are particularly delighted to be here this afternoon as we are also celebrating Lisa's inaugural lecture as the new holder of the Richard G. Starmann Senior Chair in Peace Studies. If it weren't for the pandemic, we would have now, after this lecture, we would have gone out and celebrated with Lisa in a very nice reception and potentially dinner even. But I'll have to give you all a rain check or perhaps a COVID check to be cashed when we resume some semblance of normalcy, hopefully soon. As many of you know, this moment has been long coming. Since the retirement of Peter Wallenstein in 2018, the previous and first holder of this endowed position. But the wait was worth it. The Starmann Chair in Peace Studies comes with two unique responsibilities. One responsibility is tied to the legacy of Mrs. Kroc. As we all know, Dick Starmann was a senior vice president at McDonald's Corporation and a senior advisor to John B. Kroc, and is the co-trustee of the estate of John B. Kroc. He's also an advisory board member of the Institute. Dick was supposed to be here with us, but had to change his plans due to weather and the upcoming storm. So Dick, I think he's zooming in. I'm sharing, hello, Dick, and we welcome you to our community via Zoom, and hope to see you here soon as the weather gets better and we can plan for another visit of yours. Dick Starmann played an instrumental role in shepherding Mrs. Kroc's generous gifts to the Institute. And we are grateful to him for his ongoing support and commitment to the Institute and to the preservation of Mrs. Kroc's legacy. The holder of the Starmann Chair embodies our ongoing commitment to the vision of Mrs. Kroc and Father Hesberg, who together teamed up to establish a world-class institute for the study and research of peace and justice. And objectively speaking, we know that their goal has been achieved, obviously, purely objectively. The second responsibility of the holder of the Starmann Chair is that the holder of the Starmann Chair is encouraged to play an active role in the intellectual life of the Institute, and in fact, be one of our intellectual leaders. This is already happening. Lisa is already fully immersed in teaching our master's and PhD students, the next generation of peace studies scholars and practitioners. Additionally, Lisa is now spearheading a new initiative, the Afghan Peace and Development Research Program, to support and amplify the voices of Afghan peace and development scholars and practitioners. This is done in partnership with the Polti Institute, so Lisa is already building bridges with other units at the Kiosk School, which is really exciting. And I know that there will be much more will come from here. So I look forward to working with you, Lisa, in this capacity as a Starmann Chair, and I really warmly welcome you to our community. I'll give the stage now to Professor Ernesto Verdeja to give a proper scholarly introduction of Lisa. Ernesto doesn't introductions here amongst us, and he was asked to do so because of his own expertise in artificial intelligence, peace building, violence. So Ernesto, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So I'm not sure what the etiquette is. Do I take this off? Is that, yeah, okay. There you go. Thank you, Asher. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce my colleague, Lisa Schirch, this afternoon. I was originally asked to introduce Lisa because we in fact do have some overlapping interests, particularly on the corrosive role that social media disinformation, conspiracy thinking, and surveillance capitalism have on democracy. In recent years, Lisa has worked extensively to study the ways in which social media can serve as both an asset and a threat, to use her language, to democratic practice. As a senior research fellow at the Toda Peace Institute, Lisa has directed the Social Media Technology and Peacebuilding Program to study the impact of social media on conflict and to catalyze civil society activity to use peacebuilding skills to address social media threats such as disinformation, hate speech, and digital harassment. Indeed, these new technologies today represent major opportunities for connecting activists and rights defenders, but they also pose significant dangers, including by amplifying hate speech, by undermining the legitimacy of evidence-based research and news, promoting conspiracy narratives that can generate significant social tensions, and they can also legitimize violence against vulnerable populations and democratic institutions. Lisa's most recent book, Social Media Impacts on Conflict and Democracy, The Tectonic Shift. I should actually say, I think it's her most recent book. She has so many books. It's hard to keep track of. So I think I'm right. It seems to be the most recent book. It's certainly one that I have avidly read. In any case, that book brings together scholars and analysts to think through how disinformation spreads through a study of numerous country case studies. Lisa provides an expert framing on how to understand these perils, while also outlining a host of concrete, achievable, yet far-reaching responses to these dangers. It is, and I say that quite honestly, a must-read book for anyone concerned about democracy and human rights today. Now, Lisa's interests included numerous other topics in a career that has seen her cover the globe. She's been a fellow at the Alliance for Peacebuilding and visiting scholar at George Mason University's School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and taught in the graduate conflict transformation program at Eastern Mennonite University, where she was there for 23 years. And her 10 or so books have been translated into numerous languages, so you can certainly find a version to read, however you'd like to do so. She's conducted conflict assessment and participated in peacebuilding planning alongside local civil society colleagues in over 20 countries. And as a practitioner, she's also facilitated and participated in the design of national peace processes in Fiji and Afghanistan, and written extensively about the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, as well as worked as a consultant for the United Nations Development Program, the World Bank, governments of Switzerland, the Netherlands, and the United States. She's also a member of numerous advisory and research boards, including the Global Community for Engagement and Resilience Fund in Geneva, the UN Development Programme's International Advisory Group on Infrastructures for Peace, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands International Advisory Committee of Security and Rule of Law. And she's also worked as a co-chair of a major working group for the US State Department engaging with religious actors. So her career is very, very wide-ranging. I could go on and on. There's much more I could say, but I think one of the things that comes away from this brief overview is her deep commitment, both as a scholar and as a practitioner, to advancing justice and advancing human rights in the world today. It is a real deep honor and a real pleasure to introduce you here and to have you as a colleague and also as a friend. So please join me in welcoming Lisa.
Thank you, Dr. Verdeja and Dr. Kaufman. I appreciate the warm introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Here at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, which is housed within the Keough School for Global Affairs, we research and we teach both about the causes of conflict and strategies for building peace through human security, social cohesion, and social justice that emphasizes human dignity. And these are exactly the reasons why I'm so thrilled to join this community and work toward these things with all of you. here in the room, as well as those who are online, who are some alumni, friends, colleagues from around the world. In today's talk, I will share with you about 20 stories. Most of them are very short. From the countries highlighted on this map. The countries in red are the countries, or slash blue and red are countries where there are stories of technology's real harm to humanity, and the stories in blue are sort of highlighting where there are stories of peace tech or digital peace building at work. The striped countries are examples of both. I also want to begin by talking about Mrs. Joan B. Kroc and her legacy here. We're sitting in the Hesburgh Center, which was built with the money that Mrs. Kroc donated, with the help of Dick Starmann, who is our friend and colleague here, and who we owe the honor of being Joan Kroc's representative to us today. What I find fascinating about Mrs. Kroc's legacy is that she cared both about peace, donating for this center at the University of Notre Dame, but also about the news media. And she donated the largest donation ever also to National Public Radio. Mrs. Kroc understood the importance of news and media in keeping a society free and democratic and peaceful. And we see those relationships between information and peace today more than perhaps we ever understood before. The book that we have just finished with the Toda Peace Institute, which was my institutional home before this position, it was a group project. We had a global set of researchers working in 13 countries, mostly in the global south, to help us understand how social media was impacting peace and democracy in those countries. And the researchers we first presented this research in San Diego in 2019, right before the pandemic, at the last conference I've attended in a really long time. You can see them from Venezuela, Kenya, Jordan, Brazil, Colombia, Northern Ireland, Zimbabwe, Egypt, and India. We had researchers from all of these countries come and present their research. The next book that I'm writing, which is the focus of my work this year at the Kroc Institute, is to write a book on digital peace building and peace tech, which the research question is, can or is technology scaling social cohesion, human security, and social justice? Can we do it better? And the provocative question that I will answer on one of my last slides is, can Facebook become a force multiplier for human dignity, to heal social divides, and to improve democracy? So I'll leave that question hanging for about 30 minutes. All right. One of the interesting things about the history of human technology is many of the tools that humans have built have been dual use. You can think of the first time somebody made a knife. We make food with it and we can hurt people with a knife. Same thing with drones and satellites. And now also our laptops have become weapons of mass destruction if we read the stories of how Facebook and Twitter are impacting the world. But we also know that Facebook is also connecting people. And actually what's so interesting about this digital technology is really, for the first time in the history of humanity, you had a huge technology company have an explicit mission to connect people. They were trying to build what they even called peace technology back in the early 2000s. And you can still see when Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, talks about the mission of the company, it's still to give people the power to share and make the world more open and connected. He's always talking about building relationships, which is the heart of the work that we also do at the Kroc Institute. So here is this platform specifically designed to be peace technology. And yet, if you read the books coming out from the New York Times and the best journalists in the world who are studying this organization, this platform, you will just read a litany of the harms that are happening because of Facebook. So it's definitely a dual use technology. I want to start with the story of Ukraine, which is probably on a lot of our minds if you're listening to any news source these days, because it seems to be the headlines. Ukraine sits next to Russia. Russia is in red because they're spreading disinformation. But what's interesting about Ukraine is that there's both malware attacks, which are taking down electrical, healthcare, different forms of electrical grids that society uses and needs, but then also the cybersecurity attacks, which are spreading disinformation into all the countries actually that surround Russia. So disinformation has become like this new threat of cybersecurity. The old generation of cybersecurity experts were mostly focused on thinking about how malware was going to affect our national security, our global security. And now we see that Ukraine is actually the test site for the kind of cyber war where actually you don't need takes on the border because you're able to completely take a country down in their minds and in their electrical and health grids. What's also interesting about Ukraine is it's a space for innovation of peace tech. In the Donbas region of Ukraine, which is on the eastern part of the country, there has been an ongoing digital dialogue between people in the country, in civil society, who are trying to address the problems that exist and the divisions that exist in the country and address the disinformation that's coming out of Russia about those divisions. What we're finding is that people who have a hard time sitting in the same room, either for geographical reasons or because of the scale of the numbers of people who need to be involved, technology enables us to do this. Again, in the region of Russia, in the middle of this map is the country of Lithuania. Above that on the map, you'll see Finland. Finland and Lithuania are both countries that are innovating peace tech. In Lithuania, there are civil society movements resisting Russian disinformation by forming social movements, thousands of volunteers. And they talk about confronting Russian troll armies. What's fascinating, I first learned about this democracy movement about 5 years ago from democracy activists in other countries. But now actually NATO has made a movie about the Lithuanian elves who fight the Russian trolls because they're so powerful. And there's this recognition that NATO and the US military, their number of people working on cybersecurity is relatively small. And yet when you hear the Pentagon talk about security threats, almost all of them have to do with cybersecurity issues. NATO has put out this new military doctrine called cognitive warfare that is very scary, like most military doctrine. NATO says that in the next generation, the brain will be the battlefield. Humans are the contested domain. Future conflicts will likely occur among the people digitally first by dividing and conquering, and then physically thereafter in proximity to hubs of political and economic power. So this strategic doctrine that has been put out now is also being embraced in the United States. And what they say they're countering is what's increasingly known as digital authoritarianism, where there are countries who are now hiring thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not millions of cyber troops, people who sit in warehouses and office buildings and are troll armies. So they're pretending, they're agents of the state, pretending to be private citizens or groups, and they are playing a variety of roles. Oxford University's program in computational propaganda has identified these countries who have authoritarian leadership that are suppressing, discrediting, and drowning out democracy activists, human rights activists. And they note at Oxford University, which has reported actually to the US Senate in a bipartisan Republican-Democrat report, that these countries are not only surveilling and intervening in sort of this cognitive warfare within their countries, but also globally into other countries as well. In China, there is a strategy, and I want to back up here a minute. The last computational propaganda strategy is drowning out information. It's diluting it. So when, for example, in China, people start talking about democracy on WeChat, which is the social media network, people's email and their texting platform. So this one platform is everyone's life. You will see a flood of Hello Kitty strategic distraction coming online onto the social media platform. It's diluting any real talk about democracy by distracting people with cute cats. I considered putting up Biden's new cat, which has been all over the news this week, but I decided against that. There are many new books coming out showing like this new cyber war that's happening not through malware, but through social media. And focusing on mostly Facebook and Twitter, but there's lots of smaller social media channels that are operating in the same way. They're called the perfect weapon. They're called the weaponization of social media and how social media is reshaping conflict. In 2017, the US Senate held a hearing on Russian social media intervention in the 2016 election. This was a bipartisan report. I wonder sometimes if it would be produced in today, given the amount of polarization that we have. But there was agreement by all the US intelligence agencies that Russia was using Facebook and planting memes in the US election cycle to dissuade and sway people to vote differently than they would have. Many news stories talked about how Russian trolls were using meme warfare to divide America. Russia started by, again, not saying they were Russia, but pretending to be US groups. They had a group called Blacktivist that was targeting African-American voters. They targeted women voters. They targeted progressive candidate followers. You can see that they started by posting memes that are not very political, kind of cute memes. They wanted people to just join those groups so that then they would get the follow-up reports. In the top there, they were focusing on Black-owned businesses and Black health and beauty, very non-political topics to try to get Black voters to be following these groups. They targeted Christians with memes that have, if you're a Christian, you have a hard time scrolling past that. Russian memes were aimed at voters in sort of three different ways: voter suppression, where the memes were suggesting that none of the candidates really cared about Black voters, and a real Black voter should just avoid voting altogether. They were trying to target voters away from Clinton and other Republican candidates by telling people not to vote for anyone other than Trump on the one hand, but then they were also swaying people away from Clinton by targeting moderate Democrats and arguing that they should not vote for somebody that they would argue Jesus would not want anyone to vote for. So we've talked now about cyber attacks through disinformation and through strategic distraction. Technology and social media in particular is being used also for surveillance. And in China, the case of the Uyghurs, the media this week was covering this again, how the Chinese government denies that there were 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps being reprogrammed in their own form of cognitive warfare in the analog world. We now know in December, the Washington Post published that in Chinese newspapers, they're advertising for social media companies to start surveilling academics, like people here at the University of Notre Dame who might be studying China. So there's this alerting surveillance around the world. In Venezuela, there's biometric IDs that are being used to surveil the public. Human rights activists in Venezuela that I work with report that while this is being sold to the public as helping distribute food, because there's food rations in Venezuela, what the real thought is that it's a way of surveilling their social media posts and deciding who actually gets food rations or not based on what their political views are. So there's some evidence emerging that this is a very shady way of punishing people with humanitarian food for having the wrong political opinions. In just today's Haaretz news, this ongoing story of Israeli NSO spyware being used on Palestinians, but also Israelis. This kind of surveillance technology through social media is increasing. The next strategy or problem with social media I want to talk about are internet shutdowns. So what's happening in many of the authoritarian countries is when you start having protests, and if you remember back to 2011 at the Arab Spring, there was so much hope that social media was going to be this wonderful tool for democracy activists, and they were going to use these nonviolent tools to overcome their authoritarian leader. What has happened is that the authoritarian leadership in Egypt has just shut the internet down repeatedly so that people do not have access to information. And that's not the only place it's happening. In Ethiopia, Facebook has been very tied to mobilizing people to commit killings of other ethnic groups. But then anytime there's a protest about those killings, the government will shut down the internet. Again, it's been happening sort of across the African continent, where a leader will just decide to turn off information. We also know that social media is being used to spread ideologies of violent extremism and terror. And the most clear case of this, is from the New Zealand case, but we first learned about this really through ISIS and Al-Qaeda, that there was all kinds of recruitment happening. ISIS was putting out, sometimes thousands of Twitter posts a day and videos to recruit people to their cause. And so you started seeing a lot of tech companies begin to work on the challenge of terrorist recruiting on social media. In this case of the New Zealand mosque massacre, and these are photos of the individuals who've lost their lives there. It's very connected to the Norwegian white supremacist Anders Breivik, who wrote a manifesto on white supremacy, on Dylan Roof's attack on a Black church. And so you see, you can draw lines between Norway and the US and New Zealand. Around the world, social media has spread these basically transnational terror networks that are carrying out attacks, which they then put on Facebook Live. What's absolutely stunning about this situation is Facebook usually is very slow at taking down things that are hateful or violent. They took the video down in 12 minutes. So somebody in New Zealand had a direct line to somebody high up, because there's like 40,000 people at Facebook working on moderation and security. How they knew to call the right person and get it up the chain, that's been the real challenge from a policy point of view. But even though they took it down within 12 minutes, in the next 24 hours, 1.5 million people, or it was trying to be uploaded 1.5 million times. That's a lot of people trying to put that terror video back up on the web. So something's happening, not just with our technology, but really it is amplifying the worst aspects of our set of divisions of who's in our group and who's out of our group. And these kind of polarization of society is increasing. New Zealand has really taken the lead on thinking about regulation of social media. This talk today is not on regulation. That's another talk. It's a long talk because there's like 25 different policy alternatives, and there's problems with every single one of them. There's difficult trade-offs to be made between free speech and shutting people down. I'm going to keep going through sort of the technology of peace and conflict. A group called Moonshot CVE. CVE stands for Countering Violent Extremism. They are using technology to at least map where white supremacist militia groups are growing here in the United States and in Western Europe, but they're obviously also doing so in other regions of the world. And they monitor this by looking at search engine searches. So they have a partnership with Google. They get their money from Google. And when somebody searches in my little county of Rockingham, Virginia, which has a lot of extremist militia activity, today we had an active shooter on the campus where my son is living, sort of there's these dark red spots you can see where there is a high degree of searches for KKK or all these other terrible terms that I'm not going to say out loud. But the extremist activity, the searches, people wanting to join are high. What Moonshot CVE does then is they have a redirect method so that they have an algorithm that when you search for terms like that, you will be shown a set of alternatives for things that you are not searching for, but maybe you need, such as suicide prevention hotlines, or a sign that says, "Are you lonely? Call a counselor." Or it shows a video about democracy or multiculturalism. So it's redirecting people toward material that might actually be helpful for them. What's interesting is the link that gets the most clicks is, "Are you lonely? Do you want to talk to a counselor?" So when we start talking about what is the cause of violent extremism, again, that's another presentation, another book, but it's, we have a problem of mass loneliness and mass digital radicalization. A professor at Oxford University, Phil Howard, has written this book, Lie Machines, because it's not just that we have countries, states like Russia spreading disinformation and malware. It's not just that we have surveillance or that people are, non-state actors are trying to recruit. The platforms themselves are amplifying the worst aspects of human nature. And he calls his book Lie Machines because on social media, this has been proven by MIT, false information spreads 6 times as fast as true information. And this is not by bots, it's by humans. And it has to do with our brains and what catches our attention on social media, false and inflammatory information. And what this is leading to, and my colleague, Dr. Verdeja, came to my class a couple of weeks ago and talked about epistemic insecurity, when you have no idea what is real and what's not real, because you see so many different news sources that are saying the exact opposite. All we have to do is look around us and look at the pandemic and climate change and realize we can no longer solve global problems because we don't have the same source of news, and there is epistemic insecurity. We don't know how to agree upon facts. Very quickly, I teach a class on how social media works. The companies who are designing social media platforms need us. Their profit model is based on how long we stay on the platform. So they're designing to keep our attention. False and inflammatory posts garner the most attention, and that's because the brainstem in the back of our heads is where human attention tends to be driven from. It's where our fight and flight instinct comes from, and it's where emotional triggers us. It hijacks our prefrontal cortex. So this is the neuroscience. It's why NATO calls it the weaponization of neuroscience. It's the weaponization and cognitive warfare, where we're being taken down into these very primal emotions of hate and division with other groups, because that's what companies are profiting from, because it keeps us longer on their platforms when we're feeling anxious and aroused and angry. So some people in Silicon Valley call Facebook an outrage machine. And they talk specifically about the algorithms. The algorithms decide what everyone sees on their Facebook feed. And these algorithms tend to promote extremism and falsehood. It's true on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, on many of them. So there's a profit model based on extremism. Apple CEO says that this is the core problem of technology, and he separates it. If with Apple, we sell you software, you pay for it. With Facebook, they give you something for free because you're the product. They're selling your private information, they're selling your data and your attention to advertisers. The horror stories of what's happening with Facebook are coming from around the world. This Reuters investigation notes how the Myanmar military spread disinformation that fomented genocidal level violence. In India, the same against the minority Muslim community. COVID tracking apps there have conflated the virus with Muslim communities. In Zimbabwe, across Nigeria, across the planet, social media, the algorithms of oppression, there's the sort of weapons of math destruction. There's loads of books and research now showing that it's the design of these platforms and the algorithms that run it that are polarizing our world and making peace building so much more difficult. I'll switch now to talking about peace tech. Part of my research this year is finding digital indicators, ways of measuring social cohesion, human security, and social justice. This would be a way that I would define what is peace building. We work on each of these things. It's conceptually heavy and dense, so I'm going to just stick with telling stories of how peace tech is addressing this. But I want to jump back to McDonald's because the Kroc money that has funded this place came because Mr. Ray Kroc found a way of automating a sandwich shop and making hamburgers faster than the other shops. And really what we're talking about with peace tech is this question of scaling and automating some of the work that we do. Robot mediators, mass use of technology for inclusion in peace processes. It's actually similar in terms of thinking about how do we scale things up. Part of the scaling is a data for peace initiative. The UN is running now e-analytics to gather data that can help support peace operations. Some of the first peace tech companies were coming out of Sri Lanka. This organization, Ground Views, which was a citizen journalism outlet, ICT for Peace Foundation. ICT stands for Information Communication Technology. Also in the early 2000s, then a new technology coming out of Nairobi, of East Africa, where Ushahidi has really taken off. What's interesting about the peace tech generation is I've made trips now to Silicon Valley, and when I go there, it's a peace building desert. Nobody's ever heard of peace building. It's about as far away from the field of peace building as you can get in the world, because anywhere else I go now, people know what I'm talking about in terms of what is peace building. But in Silicon Valley, there's not a lot of people doing peace building or using that term. But in Kenya, you have major NGOs who've been doing peace building for decades. Actually, some of the earliest peace building work was happening there in the 1960s and 1970s with the label peace building and with Nairobi Peace Initiative. You have people in Nairobi going to the same coffee shops who work at the tech companies and who work in the NGO sector doing peace building or with the UN. So you actually have the physical spaces where peace builders and tech people are getting together. And that's also true in Nigeria, in Abuja, and other capital cities where there's a tech sector that's very close to an NGO sector, where the tech sector has friendships that are telling them what are the humanitarian needs for technology, what are the development needs, what are the peace building needs. So the most innovation in peace tech is coming out of these other centers and not our own Silicon Valley here. Ushahidi was really interesting because we know there was election violence in Kenya. And on a regular phone app, it enabled people anywhere in the country to send in a warning that they were seeing the signs that violence might erupt before the election or during the election. And then that information immediately went to the police as well as community mediators who had been trained by the UN Development Program. So you had this rapid response of both a civilian first response and then a police military second response to be able to prevent violence from breaking out. So this kind of mapping software where you have user-generated content in real time has proven very effective for humanitarian development, all kinds of peace building activities. In Syria, a group called Hala Systems is running a program called Sentry that provides early warning of airstrikes to civilians. So Sentry has sensors around the country in Syria. And when they can detect that a plane is approaching a town, alarms will go off and people have maybe 30 seconds to a minute to get to some kind of shelter, which is better than not having those 30 seconds or a minute. In Syria, the Carter Center is also doing conflict mapping, which is a real-time shifting of where the armed groups are located and where they're moving to show what kinds of political solutions that they might be talking about in Geneva, what is actually realistic given the movement of troops on the ground. Our friends in Northern Europe, and I'm honored to take the shoes of Peter Wallenstein, and they're definitely too big for me, I would say, but the University of Oslo, Uppsala, Prio, SIPRI, these are well-known peace research institutes. They have just announced in December the Peace Science Infrastructure, a program which is trying to look at this kind of peace data and standardize it and be a convening place for it to be stored. Peace Tech Lab, which is in Washington, DC, is running a variety of different programs. This one they ran with Facebook, and I should say Facebook is partnering with a variety of different civil society groups and peace building groups around the world, because Facebook is now, making billions of dollars a year. It's one of the largest corporations, most profitable, and they have a lot of money, and they know they have a social cohesion problem, and they are partnering with groups trying to fix that. And this project is hiring local researchers, peace building organizations, to map the terminology, the lexicon of hate speech in local languages with the local metaphors and et cetera, so that then Facebook can code this with artificial intelligence to find algorithms to take it offline. So they have several dozen of these hate speech lexicons. One of the most interesting things, as I noted at the beginning of this talk, about peace tech is that early on, Silicon Valley thought that the tools that they were building at Google, at YouTube, that they were going to be building empathy between people in the world by connecting people. Stanford psychology professor B.J. Fogg believed that tech was basically automatically a force for good. And he taught classes on using technology to support peace. So back in 2003, 2004, he was using the term peace technology at Stanford University, just as many of the people who now run these major companies were studying at Stanford. And basically, Stanford University has really had a tremendous impact on Silicon Valley. B.J. Fogg actually said in 2007 that Facebook was such a force multiplier for peace that world peace would be possible within 30 years. By the year 2037, he predicted that this tool could be used. Unfortunately, B.J. Fogg did not teach ethics in those early classes on persuasive technology, and many of the company's growth sectors ended up using his book, Persuasive Technology, more for keeping people longer on the platform. So they were designing for certain behaviors, but not necessarily peaceful behaviors. But what Stanford University did is they changed the name and the focus of his Persuasive Technology Lab to what it now is, which is the Peace Innovation Lab. And I'm actually a partner at the Peace Innovation Lab. We're trying to look for indicators and ways of designing technology that can have this positive social cohesion impact. We'll see if it's going to happen. Another Silicon Valley example are Airbnb and Uber, which another Notre Dame faculty member writes about the sharing economy. Sort of, how did these forms of technology, Uber and Airbnb, get people to trust total strangers, where you do have people of different skin colors, different religions, very different countries sharing each other's homes in places all over the world. So there's an Airbnb peace theory that this kind of tech enables people to trust each other. At eBay, which was owned and started by Pierre Omidyar, the online dispute mechanism that they used at eBay for the disputes between people who were using the site to sell their used goods has now solved millions of disputes online. It's an automated online dispute resolution service. Colin Rule, who was a conflict resolution expert and one of the rare people who understands the tech world and also is a conflict resolution expert, was the one who started this, and now he runs online mediation, online dispute resolution. I should say John Paul Lederach, a professor also here at the Kroc Institute, has gone on to work for the Omidyar network, which now funds peace building all over the world. So there's sort of the genetic trace of what's happening in Silicon Valley. In Canada, a group has taken this idea of online mediation quite a step further. And they have this platform called Smart Settle, which has now been able to win court cases with parties, basically just using a computer to find and generate solutions to their conflict. They have a new generation of robot mediators. And one of my former professors from university actually just published this article last year. I heard him give a presentation on it last week, that they compared user satisfaction. So users, negotiators, people who are undergoing mediation, do they prefer a robot, a screen, so a computer doing their mediation, or a human being being a mediator? And the robot mediator was rated highest for positive perceptions of the mediation experience, more satisfied with the outcome, and thought that the mediator's advice was more useful. As a mediator for many years myself, it's a little confusing to me how anybody would want to talk to a mediator, but they're perceived as being more unbiased, more fair. A group called More in Common in the US are taking parts of the mediation process. Part of the mediation process is reality checking. Do we really perceive each other accurately? And the perception gap quiz can be embedded in Facebook and other places to check whether Republicans and Democrats accurately perceive the other's point of view. So reality checking about whether maybe we agree on, maybe we have more in common than we think we do. And the results are always interesting. I did not pass the quiz, I failed. So it's interesting. Another group, Build Up, they're a peace tech NGO based in Europe, but they did an intervention in the US called the Commons, which was an intervention designed with part bots and part human interveners, trying to model healthy communication. How can people communicate about issues where they're passionate without resorting to cyber harassment and attacks and hate speech? In Germany, there are also these sort of communication movements where in Germany, you know, as with the United States, there's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. This movement, the English translation is I am here. It's Ich bin hier in German, a digital movement to show empathy and solidarity. So when somebody sees hate speech or cyberbullying in German Facebook, this group of volunteers, much like the Lithuanian elves, will get on and try to defend and humanize the victim of those attacks. These kinds of efforts are happening around the world. Search for Common Ground in Sri Lanka is amplifying the use of technology by community youth peace builders with the cyber guardians, digital peace literacy. In Israel, Palestine, this Games for Peace is using the video game Minecraft. If I have a son who's played Minecraft for a decade, you know, it's a popular game. It's a way of fostering empathy and communication. There is a whole other lecture or class on technology for humanitarian work. I'm not covering very much of that, but in Jordan, what you can see is that there are elements of social cohesion built into that refugee response network or response use of technology. So social media apps in Amman, Jordan, are connecting refugees there with the local neighborhoods where refugees are living. In Colombia, the British Council has given technology, video cameras to youth who have been through war to videotape their experience, to document their experience of trauma healing and resilience, and to tell those stories by making like digital storytelling videos to share on social media. The UN and many groups in Geneva, including my colleague Andreas Herblinger, have been writing about how to use technology for digital inclusion and peace processes. So this is sort of building on the online dispute resolution that eBay has used to saying, how do we scale that up? And how do we have technologies that allow thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to participate in discussion of the issues that are at the heart of the peace accord being discussed mostly by diplomats or the core people. There have to be technologies that allow for more people to be involved. And as I close, I want to tell you about Polis, which is this technology which actually is easily embedded in Facebook. And that's why I think there is hope for Facebook to become, to scale up social cohesion. Polis has been used now around the world, mostly in Taiwan, which had sort of a democratic crisis back in 2014. And they started a digital ministry in Taiwan that was looking for software technology platforms that would allow people to build consensus on policy issues. A programmer in Oregon who had had Marshall Rosenberger's nonviolent communication training built this tool called Polis, which is a survey tool, but what it does is it groups people's ideas together and visualizes where people have common ground. And repeatedly now, they've done it dozens of times on dozens of different issues in Taiwan. They've used this software and it has produced legislation 80% of the time. So over a span of 3 or 4 months on very polarized issues, people naturally come to listen to the arguments, use their prefrontal cortex instead of that emotional core of the brain, and actually are able to like move toward, now I understand the other points of view. Now we can see and understand. And there's this realization that, we can agree on this much of the legislation. I think this has tremendous potential in the United States. I'm just waiting for a peace building organization here to talk about how do we teach American history? What do we want for policing and community safety? There's all kinds of political issues that are very polarized, where you can see from a peace builder mediator's point of view that there's common ground, but there's no mediator. There's no place to find consensus because political parties have an incentive to make things as polarized as possible and to, politically polarize every issue. Finally, just a brief note that I'm working with a variety of different groups in Silicon Valley to start this Council on Technology and Social Cohesion. Just as I talked about in Nairobi and the coffee shops where you have peace builders and techies sitting down, having coffee together, and you have this conversation of what can technology do to help peace building and what can peace building ask of technology companies. We need places for those conversations to happen. And that's what we are creating. Our first event was last month, January 6th, and we had Facebook and Meta and Twitter and TikTok, and we had all the big companies there. Because of the Facebook files and Frances Hogan, there's always a silver lining. They're very interested in talking to peace builders now. So we have potential and momentum. We'll be launching it in May. Closing observations. I tell my students here, that you're going to face digital threats like this warning of how technology is changing our world is going to affect all of our work. It's also a huge job creation problem. So you see right now, governments, technology companies, and civil society organizations trying to hire people who understand technology and understand peace building, development, and humanitarian assistance. Before we open it up for questions, I have questions of my own. What are the dangers and unintended impacts? If people in 2007, when Facebook started, thought it was going to be peace technology, people's predictions about the impacts that technology can have gone way wrong so far. How are we going to anticipate these worst case scenarios? And what gets lost when we add robot mediators and other technologies to our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I think there are many questions up that are already people are thinking about. I'll start with the one, and that is the actors, the agents that you are talking about. You started with states, and then you moved to non-states. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about who are the agents, the agencies that are the focus of your work, and how do we distinguish between the states and the non-states? And I'm also thinking even from the perspective of, the big red spot there, Russia. You could have, malign Russia hackers sitting in Cambodia and even Russians hiring Cambodians to do the work for them. So where are the lines in terms of state, global, non-state actors in this mapping of yours? First question, and then we'll take other questions.
I think it's more useful to look at the dynamics of disinformation, because both state and non-state actors are using it and are making their own fake groups and recruiting and distorting politics. But I think, in my class that I'm teaching on digital peace building and peace tech, my student Deborah, who's here today, mentioned, we need a global treaty on this. We need somehow to get above both the states and the non-states, because it's going to be hard to reach agreement with so much division and in terms of how governments themselves feel about this technology. So there was a panel last week at the Alliance for Peacebuilding conference on, would the UN even be the right situation? The technology companies themselves are larger than many states today. So we're figuring this out, how to tackle this new kind of global threat.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic and very interesting and compelling presentation. I think I just have maybe a question a little bit more about power. This reminds me a lot about contact theory, right? If we can help people see what they have in common, we can build bridges of understanding. And I keep thinking, though, about the materiality of what happened in Venezuela, of like they were actually using this then to not give food to certain groups. And I guess I'm just wondering a little bit more about when there's very unequal power dynamics, when you're still bringing groups of people together to better understand each other, but there's, structural violence, cultural violence. Are there, I guess maybe in some ways, I think the question I have is like, what would be the next steps, or is that kind of being discussed?
So yeah, the chart that I had about the different theories of change, there's social cohesion is one of them, human security and social justice. So part of the book that I'm writing is looking at cases of shifting power where there is situations of injustice, whether algorithmic discrimination and bias is happening, or in like here in the United States or in places like India, but also, around the world, nonviolent social movements are using technology to mobilize power. So in Nigeria, the #EndSARS movement against the security apparatus there is a powerful civil society movement. And the example I gave from Lithuania of how civil society is mobilizing the power, not necessarily against their own government, but sort of this information that's being waged, warfare that's being waged on them. So sometimes it's about the social cohesion, and then sometimes it's about empowering or giving agency or enabling people to use these technology tools to build power for themselves. Thanks for that question.
We've got quite a few questions coming in online. We've had about 130 people watching, so a very engaged audience, but from Professor Atalia Omer, she said, social cohesion is articulated here as a good. Can you say a bit more about what you mean by that? What is the ethical discourse that goes into conceptualizing the social cohesion? And would we also need good and better education systems for people to have critical thinking skills? How do you connect media and tech focus on peace building and other areas of work?
That's a great question too. Actually, my students in my class were the ones, I drew this diagram about information, peace, and social cohesion, and democracy as being related to each other. And they're like, well, no, because you can have false information, you can have an authoritarian government, and there's a lot of social cohesion because everybody's believing in the same thing, which may not be very empowering for them or true. So thank you, students, for that insight. I think, there's the peace building community in the United States has discussed this a great deal in terms of how do we talk about building empathy with technology without disempowering people or coming into power issues of social injustice. More conversation is needed for sure. So yeah, I try to be very clear that it is about human agency. And so when social cohesion requires humans to have agency when they are living under a dictator and being fed a diet of false information. It sort of is automatically, they might agree with their neighbor, but that's not necessarily a situation of social cohesion. Another question?
I had a question going back to what I thought was really striking when you were describing the violent extremism, and the first or the most clicked is, are you lonely? So this is probably an existential crisis beyond the realm of this talk, or many talks.
Right.
But do you know of anyone doing work or trying to measure or come up with ways that technology can counter loneliness, and maybe as a part of peace building?
Yes, there's I have books on my bookshelf on digital social work and all kinds of digital suicide prevention. And I'm not sure they call it digital loneliness prevention, but it's basically that. These tools are not good actually for helping people really feel a sense of belonging. And a lot of the research on violent extremism has shown, the more lonely people are, the more they turn to extremism, and they get involved in groups online that give them a sense of belonging. And they may carry out violence on behalf of those groups, as they have a number of times here in North America. I don't think we yet really know how to do that. The whole field of violent extremism is looking more towards this psychological drivers, the individual psychological drivers, that people often do have political grievances, but they're mobilized by a sense of personal despair and lack of options in people's lives. And so while, countering violent extremism and that whole set of activities and movements really didn't address that very much in the first generation, there's a lot more effort on that now.
Okay, I'm going to combine a couple from online. So one from a potential Master of Global Affairs student from Morocco asking, what's your advice for future humanitarians that are aspiring to build peace on social media? Where would you suggest they start? And then from Professor Kat Bolton, wondering if you could talk about what are the age and generational aspects of countering online extremism. I ask because I know that youth are the most on top of shifts in language, memes, et cetera, and most able to do that work. But of course, groups of youth saying they can address something aren't necessarily taken as seriously by the UN or Facebook. So 2 questions.
Those are great questions. I know that at Search for Common Ground, they've been using media-based strategies for peace building for decades. And they've been really trying to shift to digital media. And they're realizing that all the leadership at Search for Common Ground are aging, like myself. We're in our 50s basically, and we're not the best ones to use TikTok. We're not digital natives in the sense of having grown up with it. And so they're hiring intentionally younger people who are fluent already in a lot of social media strategies that others of us have to read a lot of books about to try to figure out how is that actually working. So yeah, I think that companies are hiring younger people to work in the field of peace building with technology. If you want to learn more about it, for the student who's asking, the Alliance for Peace Building has a monthly working group. We feature new forms of peace tech every month, third Tuesday of the month at 11 a.m. I facilitate that group. Basically, we're just trying to feature many of these case studies. Next month or 2 months from now, we have something from Yemen, how people are using memes to foster peace. There's a lot of really creative stuff happening around the world, and we try to just feature that innovation.
One last online question.
Okay, so from Joshua Lupo, the McDonald's example assumes in my mind that the technological advancements driven by neoliberalism and capital can be distinguished from their use for peaceful ends. Can you say more about how we do this? It seems that the risk is that we increase the suffering caused by neoliberal economic policies when we adopt some of these forms of technological development.
I think the profit model of every company needs to be understood. And I think the focus of this talk is looking at automation as scaling anything up. So it's a different profit model that we're not talking about a profit model in terms of peace tech. That's actually part of what the problem has been so far, is that Facebook's profit model, which extracts user attention and data, is what drives their algorithm and drives algorithmic extremism. So Stanford University is trying to figure this one out. You know, is there a profit model for peace tech that maybe uses the LEED structure, so rewards companies, just as LEED is an environmental standard. They have the Hague Peace Standard that they've developed at Stanford, which tries to quantify how a technology company is contributing to social cohesion, social justice, human security, trying to get at that profit model. It's not really functional at this point, but it's aspirational, because we know that this profit model has to be addressed in terms of amplifying peace.
Can I follow up?
Yes.
Can we think about your arguments by removing profit model at all? Is it a possibility, or we always have to bring in profit model when we deal with the technology of peace or violence?
That's a great question. Right now I'm in the middle of a research project where I'm interviewing 20 executives of tech companies in Silicon Valley, and every single one of them has told me, we can't do this until there's a profit benefit for us. So talking to the people who are running the big companies, if you really want to scale something, it has to be API compatible with Facebook. So API, that's hard. I'm not going to explain all this technology right now, but there has to be able to be embedded in a corporation that's going to scale it. So Ushahidi has done very well. It sells its technology. It has tech products that it sells. We have to figure this out. So if the social media companies are saying people don't want to pay for this utility now because they've been getting it for free for 20 years, which people do say around the world, that it would lead to more injustice to somehow start charging people for this public utility, which is Facebook is basically the white pages now for people around the world. So when Facebook went down a couple months ago, all these small businesses lost their business for days. And there are real harms now for shutting Facebook down, even temporarily. Real people get hurt because they rely on it for many different things that, so it causes harm to shut it down. It causes harm to keep it on. Yeah.
Do you know what was the impact of that day or a few days where we, went off Facebook in protest? Kroc joined this movement where we disconnected from Facebook for about 3 days, I think. But somebody should actually do research and see what was the impact economically.
Yes,
Uh,
I don't think it probably had an economic impact. However, it sends a message
Right.
that people are concerned about this. And the Facebook executives know this. They are spending more money, not nearly enough in my point of view, on trying to solve these problems. And they basically already said, we're not going to change the profit model. So we have to think of tweaks to the algorithms or to the design of the platform or other features that we're discussing. But the elephant in the room is their data extraction and their attention extraction from us. So this is a very wicked problem. A wicked problem meaning it's really difficult because every time you think you have a solution, you realize, oh, the trade-off there is pretty negative too. So there's not a clear answer on what we need to do.
Yeah. So I have a few takeaways. I'll mention, I guess, two. One is, I guess, it's a very interesting observation about the need to prepare our students for the job market and making them be literate with the information, the skills, the technology that you were mentioning. The other takeaway is that we may want to reconsider a mediation program.
Sorry, Lori.
I think it might be cheaper. So thank you, Lisa, for really an engaging discussion, conversation. Am I missing a question here? Oh, go ahead. Finish up.
It's not the kind of question that has a quick answer. But from what you were saying, your presentation, particularly about the attention economy and the incentive structure that corporations have to make money for their shareholders, I mean, that's not surprising. It's hard to see how these major corporations could be incentivized to change what they're doing. And I wonder if one response, following on some of the questions that were already asked, is essentially to think about breaking them up, right? I mean, this seems to be a political, economic problem.
The problem, yeah,
And
I agree.
so
the challenge, the trade-off there is there's already a lot of smaller, there's 4chan, 8chan, there's a bunch of smaller, and they're actually more extreme. Facebook is now really the only company that has the resources to address this and invest in trying to figure out if AI is ever going to work for hate speech and disinformation, which it's not at all clear that AI will work in my point of view. But Facebook has the resources. All the other companies, if you break up Facebook, you're going to have a lot of small Facebooks, and the problem's going to be also just as bad. The problem is that all these companies need regulation. So I think regulation is the major solution, and regulation that's going to get at that profit model so that the transparency of what the algorithm is and not allowing this algorithmic extremism and algorithmic bias and discrimination to go on. Sort of, yeah, you need human rights and peace builders in there looking at all the data of what's being amplified.
thank you.
So thank you very much, Lisa, and please join me in thanking Lisa. We look forward for many more years to come of working with you as part of our community.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And everybody who can go home should go home now and run before